Hello and welcome to Essex by the Sea. I'm Owen Ward, exploring the Essex coast, finding out about the amazing and interesting stories it has to offer. This episode dropped on the morning of the 1st of February 2023. 70 years earlier, the Essex coast was submerged under a tidal surge which swept down the North Sea, overcoming the sea defences and swamping places like Harwich, Jaywick, Mersey Island, Brightlingsea, the Dengie Peninsula, Foulness Island, Canvey Island, Tilbury and Purfleet. 58 people lost their lives on Canvey Island that night, while another 37 perished in Jaywick. Railway embankments collapsed near Harwich, where the tidal surge was over 5.5 metres higher than sea level. 32,000 were evacuated from places like Canvey and Tilbury, and 160,000 acres of farmland were ruined. Cherry Borroughs has written a book called The Farmer and the Fury. It's a fiction book, but based on the true events 70 years ago and how it affected the farming community. The novel is set on an island, revolving around the main characters George and Annie Hadley, along with their 4 children. When the floods arrive, the family are in the farmhouse when water swamps their home and decimates their lands. The story evolves into how the family go on to survive the following weeks and months following the flood. Cherry's inspiration has come from her husband, who, as a child in 1953, survived the flood when the family farm was inundated by water on Foulness Island. Cherry has spent many months speaking to lots of other people who remember what happened all those years ago to capture those stories firsthand, and I asked her what impact did the Great Flood have on the Essex coast 70 years ago.
The flood, it was not just the North Sea, it came across the Atlantic as a storm and came across the top of Scotland down into the North Sea, and it coincided with the last big spring tide when there was a full moon, and that's why the tide was so high anyway. So it came over onto the island and it just submerged everything to the extent that it was thought there was nobody alive on the island, and it was only my husband's father's friend, who owned a light aircraft at the time, who flew over in his light aircraft and realised that there were survivors on the island.
We perhaps see images, black and white, grainy footage of places like Jaywick, Canvey Island, where houses were submerged right up to roof level in some of those places. It must have been quite a unusual sight for the people who were trying to form some kind of rescue.
Yes, and I think part of the reason why it was so devastating, the flood, was because there was little communication about it, in the sense of not enough warning for people. So when you talk to people about it, or when they know of relatives that were in it, they were just suddenly confronted with this massive amount of water and had little time to do much about it. So a lot of people managed to get onto their roofs to survive. And those who couldn't, sadly, did not survive.
For a rural area like Foulness Island and other parts of the Essex coast, I mean, what sort of damage did it actually do?
To the land itself, it did terrible damage. The salt water destroyed all the insects in the land and destroyed the ability to grow crops for some time after the flood. And my husband was telling me that the salt content was, I think, between 40, 60 or 80 tonnes of salt per acre. He can remember looking out across the fields as a child and seeing just lots of thousands of white threads on the ground, on the soil, which were dead worms. So the whole structure of the soil had really got destroyed and was damaged. And that took some effort to restore the land, which it was eventually, but of course it had a devastating impact on the farming community.
And although it was 70 years ago, there will be people who remember it, there will be people who, parents perhaps, were affected by this. It still has an impact, even today, on coastal communities, doesn't it?
Yes, I was talking to a young lady actually who is in her 20s, and she was telling me, she lives on Canvey Island, that they still have the siren, the flood warning, going regularly as part of their warning system for Canvey, because of course that island was very severely affected and they lost, unfortunately, lives there as well. And, there's an awareness of it wherever people live, I think, that it could happen again. Hopefully it won't, but, there is an awareness by the Essex people, I think, about it in that sense.
The sea defences since that event have been built up along the Essex coast. You can't escape the sea walls and the flood defences that have been there. But there are still parts that are deliberately left to nature perhaps a bit more and allowed to flood occasionally. But this just swamped the land and I mean, how many years did it take to recover it, as your husband said?
Well, I think for farming, it was at least 18 months to 2 years before they could grow anything, really. They tested the soil. They had help from the government at the time because, of course, food rationing was still on then, post the Second World War. And the government were keen to ensure that their national food programme was not affected too much by this. And there were, I think, over 250 farmers in Essex who were affected by the flood. And of course, that would have had a huge impact on the food supply chain in this country when it was still quite finely balanced after the Second World War. As far as certain areas are more at risk than others, of course, it depends on the sea level and the land. Some parts of the coast, for example in Shoebury-Ness, it's higher, and my husband can remember being brought from Foulness Island because it hadn't flooded so much.
What was it then that prompted you to write your book now? The Farmer and the Fury is your debut novel, I understand.
Yes, it is my debut novel. I've always wanted to write a novel, but I never found a subject that really prompted me to do it because it's a massive commitment writing a novel. I started in 2019, September 2019, and when my husband, he's been talking to me about this for a long time, but the more we spoke about it, the more I thought this is a really good story that's not really been heard from the farming community about what happened. There are lots of very good non-fiction books about the flood. And they are excellent as a reference if one wanted to look at those. But in terms of getting a story out there, that's why I wanted to write this.
And without giving any spoilers away, you mentioned obviously it's based on the lives of a farming couple. Where does the story go? As I say, without any spoilers, if you can.
Well, the story opens quite quickly with the flood itself and the devastation it caused. And we've talked a lot about the soil, but it also killed a lot of animals. Cattle, livestock, they either drowned immediately in the flood or some survived and got onto higher land. And then the problem was, particularly on Foulness Island and some of the other islands, they couldn't get the cattle off. If their farms were inland more, the army couldn't get to them. And then they had the problem of trying to keep them fed and watered, and there was no fresh water. So it ended up that a lot of the cattle and livestock had to be destroyed anyway when there was a food shortage. And my husband's father, he can remember having his pigs slaughtered. They were perfectly healthy animals, but he couldn't sustain them or feed them. So it's about that impact, the plot line, and it's about how they recover from the flood.
Was help on hand quite quickly, do you think?
Well, I think they started, from what I've been told, the rescue happened very quickly after the flood from Essex headquarters. They were rowed across in the flatties. My husband said they were called the flatties, the rowing boats. But he can remember being rowed across open fields because the army couldn't get inland to get to them. So they had to be rowed across in sub-zero temperatures and very high winds.
That was the thing, because the storm that brought it was windy, it was the 1st of February, it's winter, the days are short, the nights are still very long, 1st of February, and cold as well. This was very cold conditions, and there are reports of some of those who passed away actually passing away from hypothermia rather than drowning from the flood. And the fact that the water stayed around on the land as well, and it didn't recede straight away. Some people perhaps sort of thought, well, the tide came in, the tide went out. It isn't a tide in that sense. This is a full-on flood that affects and devastates such a large swathe of Essex.
Yes, just 2 points there. I mean, the issue of dying from hypothermia or getting pneumonia, for example, and there were lots of consequences after the flood. For example, children got whooping cough. My husband got whooping cough as a child. It was a common disease then after the flood. What I didn't realise until I wrote this book was you get a spring tide every 2 weeks right through the year. And this particular tide, 31st of January, 1st of February, was the big spring tide with the last winter moon, so the impact of the moon on the tide. So when they had to try and repair the wall, they did temporary repairs first of all, and this is on Foulness Island, and they got that wall repaired before the next spring tide in the middle of February. That was a temporary repair, and of course while they're doing it, they've still got the tide coming back in every day, ebbing and flowing, and it wasn't until they'd completely blocked that off that the wall held, and they were helped by everybody really.
One thing you mentioned in your book, you covered the story of the flood itself very quickly, and that's probably because it did come very quickly and came very much as a surprise on the 31st of January 1953, didn't it?
Yes, and obviously that's a big event in the book, and the reason I put it at the beginning of the book is because I suppose it's almost an incident it is an incident which had such devastating consequences and altered people's lives. Whether they survived the flood, whatever happened, it's something they remember.
Have people told you as part of your research whether they got any warning? Because we didn't have mobile phones, very few people had landlines even perhaps in 1953. So would the first that they knew about it would literally be the water coming over the original sea defences? Well,
I think for some people that's right. If they farmers, for example, would be aware to some extent. They'd have their barometers, they'd have some awareness, but there was an inability to do much about it. As you say, the communication lines were difficult because we didn't have that level of communication then. So you might have had the local bobby going around trying to warn people, but not communication or warning like we know today. And that's one of the reasons why it had such an impact.
Now, your book has taken a few years to be written and published. How have you found the experience of writing it?
Well, I spent almost 2 years, 18 months to 2 years, just talking to people because I wanted the primary source first-hand information and I wanted to write the story based on that. And I was writing every day bits of the book or bits about characters, etc. But I didn't actually start writing it until March 21 when I actually started doing the chapters. And then after that, when I'd finished it, I asked a group of people to read it and to give me feedback, and that's quite a scary thing to do because it goes out to people and you wait for their comments to come back, but it's a necessary thing to do because they're the reading public. So that was done, and then eventually it got to publication.
Available now, you've got a copy here just in front of us.
The cover is quite a stormy sky above the sunrise bottom. But the idea of the story is the book, it says at the beginning of the book, it's dedicated to everybody affected by the flood, whether they were in it, whether they knew relatives that were in it, whether their properties were damaged, etc. And the idea is to get the story out there because I think it's such an important story and it has such significance locally. Yeah.
Will there be a follow-up story?
I don't know at the moment. I mean, in one sense, this is unique. It stands on its own as a book, and I'm still thinking about that.
You never know. There may be a sequel to The Farmer and the Fury yet. Where can people get hold of a copy if they would like to pick up a copy themselves?
I mean, you can buy it on Amazon. You can get it Kindle version or paperback on Amazon. It's going to be going into Waterstones, hopefully in a couple of weeks' time. And it has gone out to local bookshops for consideration for them to put in their window or in their bookstores.
Fantastic. Well, Cherry, thank you so much for joining me and telling me about your book and how it all came about following the events 70 years ago. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode marking the 70th anniversary of the Great Flood.
Thank you very much.